Well, good morning and apparently good evening to some of you. Thanks so much for joining us. This is Jeremy Martin, Vice President for Energy and Sustainability at the Institute of the Americas. And we appreciate you all joining us for the latest installment of our 2017 Energy Webinar Series. And for those of you who've been participating with us for a while, you know some of the basic logistics, but let me just make sure others who may not be so familiar understand. We will, as the agenda says, do a short introduction, then we'll have a featured presentation, a formal presentation from Commissioner Marcelino Madrigal from CRE, the Energy Regulatory Commission of Mexico. And then at the end of his formal presentation, we'll have time for a question and answer session. And we manage the question and answer session via the chat function. So during the course of the presentation, you can avail yourself of the chat function, and that is where we'll pose all the questions. There won't be any audio questions. Questions will be managed here, so don't hesitate. You can pose the questions at any point during the formal presentation. We won't stop to attend to those. We'll wait till the very end, but we encourage you not to wait till the end to pose your questions. And appreciate everyone who's already figured out the chat function and sent greetings from London and Colombia. Well, Marcelino, you and I were talking about where some of the people may be participating from. I think we begin to get some sense there on the greetings we received from London and Colombia, and if I'm not mistaken, Miguel Roman is in Washington, D.C. So, well, again, welcome everyone. My name is Jeremy Martin, and we're delighted today to talk a little bit more in detail about Mexico, but particularly Mexico and the electric sector and the renewable energy potential in Mexico. For those of you who participated a few weeks ago, we spent a lot of time, and we're delighted to have Deputy Secretary for Hydrocarbons, Aldo Flores, speaking about unconventional hydrocarbon resources and opportunities in Mexico. Today, we're going to get into the elements of the important energy reforms underway in Mexico, begun over 4 years ago, but particularly what many called the sort of final piece of the energy reforms, and that was the energy transition law that was promulgated and formalized and signed into law December 2015. And the commissioner will walk us through a lot of these elements, but some of the highlights that I want to emphasize and why this has been such an important part of the overall reform, but particularly in terms of the economic and competitivity of the Mexican economy and energy sector, are what it does to the clean energy and what it does to Mexico's attraction of renewable potential, renewable energy. And obviously, we've seen through that energy transition law some very clear targets. 2018, Mexico has a target of 25% clean energy. It goes up to 30% in 2021, and it hits 35% in 2024. I know there's probably some talk about seeing how they can be a little bit more aggressive on that in conjunction with some of the efforts on emissions and climate change and the laws there. But the other thing I want to emphasize before I introduce our speaker is the success that the first two auctions, and these successes in the auctions under the electricity reform and the energy reforms pertaining to the electric sector in Mexico, have set records for some of the renewable solar in particular. The two auctions have gathered over $6 billion of investment commitments. And I think when all of us have talked for years about the energy reforms in Mexico and what it meant economically, in terms of opening the economy and making the economy more competitive, there's no better result than Mexico being able to have open auctions, a pure market-driven system to attract investment on the order of over $6 billion, but at the same time that's setting international records for pricing in terms of solar projects. Obviously, some of those prices have since fluctuated in terms of what's the world record, but the point is that Mexico is a la vanguardia at this point when we're talking about some of the developments of renewable auctions in terms of project development. So let me introduce our speaker because I don't want to steal his thunder. This is his message, and he'll get into the details of how those things came to pass, but more importantly, what's next. Marcelino Madrigal is a commissioner at the Mexican Energy Regulatory Commission, CRE. Before being named a commissioner, confirmed by the Mexican Senate, Dr. Madrigal was a senior energy specialist, and many of you probably got to know him during his time at the World Bank, where he specialized in the technical and economic operations, planning, power systems, and electricity markets. You may also remember his time when he worked at the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, also working very closely on regional energy integration, but also power systems, transmission, distribution, and all elements of the electricity markets. He has a PhD from the University of Waterloo in Canada, as well as a Master of Science from that university, and graduated from Aurelia Technological Institute. And without any further ado, it's my pleasure to host and pass the word over to Marcelino Madrigal. Dr. Madrigal, thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks also Jacqueline and the Institute of the Americas for having me in this webinar. I think it's great that we have people from many different places. I am a lover of technology, so doing this webinar is really interesting for me. So basically what I have for the presentation is to give you an overview of where we are and where we are going in terms of the implementation of the electricity reform. Please post your questions, as Jeremy said, and I think he will, filter those at the end. But basically, the idea of the presentation is that tell you where we are in terms of the clean energy power implementation of the market reform, which is for the most part, the electricity sector. So I will move the slides and send us any message if something is not working or you are not hearing me well. But basically, you know what was the reform in Mexico. Energy issues in Mexico were rooted in the Constitution. The deep reform that we had in Mexico in the hydrocarbons, gas, and electricity sector required a lot of changes, starting from the Constitution. Then you have two major pieces of legislation, which is the electricity industry law, the hydrocarbons law, and in top of the slide you see the energy transition law, which is a very important piece of the reform. There are other laws, the laws that created the system operator, the laws that gave more flexibility to the public utilities to compete in the respective markets. That's the law of CFE, the law of Pemex, the law of the regulatory entities. We already have regulators in Mexico, a 20-year-old tradition in electricity regulation, but with the reform, the regulatory bodies were strengthened dramatically. We have, I would say, regulators whose legal foundations and responsibilities are as important as any regulator in Europe or in the US. For those in the US, we at the Regulatory Commission would be like your state regulator together with your federal regulator and your reliability regulator. So in fact, in Mexico, the Energy Regulatory Commission, we have tremendous powers in regulating the electricity sector and opening up the markets. So that's sort of the contextual setting. I would say that the electricity reform in Mexico, we were late on this game as compared to our colleagues from all Latin American countries. So the fact that we are late, I think it has given us the possibility to go really fast, from learning what others have seen in the past, not 15 to 20 years. So the reform is, the pieces are the classic ones. We have split the sector into the generation, transmission, distribution, and retail segments. Generation is a fully competitive activity. We created the SENACE, which is a system and market operator. It has a different law. It's a separate institution. It used to belong to the power company, but now the system operator for 3 years now is a separate entity that is operating the market. I would say that one of the important changes here is that the reform, together with the energy transition law, is a clean energy market reform. Why? Because through markets and empowering the consumer, we are seeing how that combination is making clean energy developing happen pretty quick. And the energy transition law, there are many pieces to it, including energy efficiency targets. On the clean energy side, the targets are pretty clear. By 2024, 35% of energy has to come from clean energy. Today, as we speak, we're around 20% of our energy coming from clean energy resources. We have to mention, though, that clean in Mexico is all, the technology, solar, hydro, large and small, wind, biomass. but we also include nuclear. We have one nuclear power station in Mexico. It's roughly 2,000 megawatts, and that should be contributing maybe 2% to the existing clean energy share in Mexico. So the targets are sort of ambitious. There is an aspirational target as part of the North America Leaders Summit to even go to 50% renewables by 2025, which I personally think is completely doable, especially with what we have seen recently. As you all know, this commitment to clean energy comes from a long-standing tradition of Mexico with climate change mitigation. I think we were the first developing country that signed the Paris Agreement. Mexico is very firm on meeting its climate goals and international agreements. So going to the specifics of the energy sector, as I just mentioned, I want you to focus on the supply side. Supply for us is the retail part. So the reform basically splits consumers into two flavors: regulated consumers, which is called basic supply in Mexico. Those are regulated consumers, and unregulated consumers, which is large industries or medium-sized enterprises, and those are called qualified consumers who can select their own supplier. That doesn't mean that regulated consumers do not have choices, and we will see how recent technology developments are helping even regulated consumers access other forms of clean energy supply. So we have the transmission segment. It has been separated into a separate company by CFE. Distribution has been split into 16 regions that we regulate in a separate fashion. So we have distribution rates for 16 different regions in the country. There is pure trading also in the market. There we have the system operator, and we have generation. It's a free activity. Of course, all the generation that we had previous to the enter of the electricity market, most of it will be contracted to supply the regulated market, and I will talk about that later on. So market design, and I think this is something that has been implemented, taking into consideration all the experiences in energy reforms. I think the energy reform in Mexico understood from the beginning that you need both long-term markets and short-term markets. Why? Because long-term markets are very important to make sure you attract investment in new capacity, in new energy and clean energy supply. And of course, the short-term market, you always need it because you need to balance demand with supply. So both the long-term market, which I will explain later on, is the options that you have seen, and the short-term market have already been launched. The short-term market is already operating. The clean energy certificates market, we have a quota system by which every user has to meet the clean energy requirement. So there's a possibility to trade certificates. The requirement kicks in 2018 when this certificate market will start to operate. The medium-term market is a market in which you buy energy and capacity for a 3-year product. This market has been launched already a couple of weeks ago, and we expect to have the results of this market in February of next year. So this is a market that bridges the gap between the long-term market and the short-term market. It's basically to buy 3-year products, which I think is going to be very important, especially for the retail market, the unregulated consumers that cannot enter into really large long-term contracts like 15, 20 years, but maybe a medium-sized industry, iron manufacturer, a car exporter, maybe they can enter into 3 or less year contracts. And the capacity market, the short-term market, is a market that remunerates capacity to ensure supply adequacy. This market has already been launched. It's an ex-post market. The prices at which your capacity is remunerated have already been clear for 2016. So we have, out of all these 4 markets, 3 of them have been launched, and the clean energy market, because that's the requirement starts in 2018, it will enter into 2018. And we will see some of the numbers of the results in these markets. As I said, the short-term market is a spot market, very similar to what you see in the US in PJM. It is a co-optimized market for energy reserves. It has nodal prices. We have about 2,000 nodal prices already in Mexico. It's a market that will have financial transmission rights, and through the system operator, we will also facilitate the exchange of clean energy certificates. Of course, it's a market that operates separately, but the system operator will also have a clearinghouse for energy certificates. The medium and the long-term market, I explained already. The medium-term market has been launched. The first result will be released in February of next year. And the long-term market, basically, you contract energy capacity or clean energy to be delivered 3-4 years in advance, and for 10 years from 15 to 20 years. So basically, this is the mechanism to attract new capacity, mainly for the regulated market, and I will, explain that later on. So the clean energy certificate, we at the Commission are responsible for tracking that the requirement is being met. So we have already issued the rules for a tracking system that is being implemented. Is basically a computer system that will track the production and consumption of clean energy, and it's a system where parties can go and interact to buy and sell certificates, very similar to the certificates markets you have in the US. So this system will start its operation in 2018. And I will mention very quickly, of course, like everywhere else, transmission is a fundamental part in clean energy development. In a very short period of time, put all the pieces that you require to do three things in transmission. You need to have a transmission system that reaches all the facilities, including renewables. You have to be able to access it quickly in a non-discriminatory fashion at reasonable rates and with good quality. So for each of those things, we have an instrument, a regulatory instrument that is already operating for about 2 years ago. So the way the transmission system is planned now is completely different as it was 2 years ago. Who plans the transmission system is the system operator, with comments from the Regulatory Commission and final approval by the Ministry of Energy. So transmission planning is not handled by any power utility, and this is obvious from the theory of access, but also from the practice. It was very common that renewable energy providers had lots of trouble connecting the grid of its competitors. So the reform completely changed that. Planning is performed independently from any utility in the system. We issue transmission rates, understanding what has been happening before in Mexico, and that for renewables and for consumers to access the grid, it's very important to have very stable, simple, understandable rates. So we decided to put emphasis on recovering the cost of transmission. But what you pay to access the grid is very simple. It's a number that you find in the internet. You don't need to run complex, load flow models to understand what is going to be your transmission rate. And this is basically because we believe that, sadly, transmission is an externality, and as possible, you want to eliminate it in an efficient way. You can always eliminate this barrier, but we have very transparent, very simple pricing of transmission and distribution rates. This is very important for the market to develop. And of course, the system operator, we approve the revenue requirements for the system operator. We are the Regulatory Commission. So that means that the system operator is not depending anymore on CFE or any other utility on collecting their revenues. Clean energy development in Mexico is not new. We have learned from the past 5 years. So with the reform, the Commission, we are the responsible party for setting the reliability rules in the grid. That's why I mentioned that we are like FERC, NERC, and your state regulator at the same time. So we issue a grid code that incorporates all operating rules, planning rules for the system, and also the interconnection requirements for generation and load. and loads. And we have prepared these requirements based always in the international experience from many other countries. So we have a grid code that is really up to date with the international experiences. We have requirements for voltage frequency control that are in some cases similar to the US, in some other similar to Europe, because we have different regions in the system. Excellent. So quickly, the auctions, the long-term auctions. This is where we buy energy, capacity, and clean energy for the regulated service. So this is to create new investment to supply the future energy demand. And I want to highlight something very important, which is the process. The process in the auction is very open, is very transparent. It has enough time for all the parties to prepare. Basically, from the publication of the call for proposals to the time when you submit your bids, you have at least 40 days. The first auction was completed in 225 days, the second auction in 263 days. So the steps in the auction are all publicly available, and there is sufficient time for all kinds of parties to participate. And we have found that this is very important given the scales of renewable energy. So before you have very large projects, you say 200, 400, 800 megawatt projects, but with clean energy, solar and wind, you can have very small developers trying to enter into the market. So the idea was to give enough time so that different parties with different experiences can enter into the auction. So what is the products of the auction is energy, megawatt hours, clean energy, which is the certificate. So if you classify as clean energy, you also can sell your certificates, which is the attribute that your energy comes from a clean source, and the capacity. You know, the capacity, which in Mexico is the ability to produce energy in the peak demand period. So all generators compete to supply those three products in a very open and transparent process. This slide is very techy. I will not go, but basically the auction is select the offers that maximize the social benefit, meaning select the cheapest offers to supply the demand according to the maximum prices we are willing to pay for each of the different products, which is energy, clean energy, and capacity. So there is a maximum price in the auction set up by the Regulatory Commission. The algorithm basically selects the cheapest offers from all generators to supply the required demand. So for those of you that have worked in the power industry, this is like a dispatch, a long-term dispatch algorithm. You basically select the cheapest among all of the offers by generators. And this is where things get really surprising, especially for Mexico. First auction, the energy we wanted to buy is around 6 terawatt hours, 6 millions of certificates, basically clean energy, and 5 megawatts of firm capacity. So this is around 4,000 megawatts of installed capacity. The surprise is that the huge interest on participating in this market. So you had 81 pre-qualified bidders with 366 different proposals. So I think this flexibility in the auction, so that you could bid one project, 2 projects, 3 projects, a smaller project in one region, a larger project in another region, and making all those projects compete with each other was very attractive, and you had this humongous participation. So out of 81 pre-qualified participants, 69 were qualified, and you have 11 winners. In the second auction, the interest, very similar, very high, 68 bidders, 57 qualified participants, and 23 bidders. When I present this slide, I always make the question, when did you used to see 80 competing participants to install a gas-fired or a coal-fired power generation? It was impossible. You always had 2, 3 companies. Why? You know, economies of scales, you know, all those technologies require a very specific expertise. But with renewables, the scales can be smaller. You can have medium enterprises, large or huge companies competing among each other. So the technology progression has made competition for supplying energy very, very aggressive. So those are the results, basically a summary of the results. In the first auction, solar prices $44, wind prices $55 in average. In the second auction, solar $31 per megawatt average, and this includes everything, the energy, the clean certificate, and wind $35. When the renewable energy targets were being constructed, there was always the hesitation, is renewable energy going to increase tariffs and prices, and how much can we actually afford? All kinds of analyses were made, and if you see the result is very surprising. The maximum price we were willing to pay in the first auction was $70, which is close to our average price now, plus a margin, and the resulting price was $48. In the second auction, we were willing to pay for energy $60, and the average price was $33. So this means that meeting the clean energy targets, the incremental cost is going to be close to zero or maybe even negative. Gas prices in Mexico are around 42. I mean, gas-fired power generation, $42, $43, maybe 39, 38. You have a very, very efficient gas-fired power generation. So very surprising. So in just the period of 2 years, we have contracted 5,000 megawatts. And 5,000 megawatts is more than what Mexico has built over the past 15 years. 15 years. So in 2 years, 5,000 megawatts of renewables have been contracted, and these are the companies now operating in Mexico because they are building the power plants. They are working on it. So we have in the first auction 11 new generation companies now competing to supply the regulated service that before was provided only by CFE. In the second auction, 24 different companies, all from different countries. So in the period of 2 years, you have now 35 new agents in the market. And these are companies from everywhere: Spain, Italy, France, China, you name it. Very, very strong interest in the auctions in Mexico. And as you have heard, of course, the prices in Mexico are breaking records. Records are broken every other day. I just heard that Chile got a solar project for $31 as well. So it seems the Mexican energy reform is taking well advantage of the technology developments in renewable energy technologies. And this is a personal reflection. Why do I think it has been so attractive? Policy reasons. I think there is a very clear vision where we want to go, and that is expressed in the energy transition law. Targets that are very clear, that gives predictability to companies if this market is big or is small. There is a long legacy in Mexico of supporting climate change. So I think those very clear policy goals in the law made the Mexican market very attractive. Regulatory aspects, you hear we have very effective and simple rules to accessing the grid. None of these projects has had a problem accessing the grid. Of course, there is a due process to be followed. They know what are the transmission rates. Transmission rates are very simple to understand. They are predictable. The auction design also giving enough time for all kinds of participants to enter into this market is very important, as I said, because now you have smaller, large, medium-sized scale companies being able to participate in the generation market. And of course, it's a long-term product. This makes the projects bankable and financeable, and with that you can lower prices. And other important reasons I really think is Mexico itself as a market. Mexico is really a large economy. It is the second largest economy after Brazil in Latin America, and our market was closed for business. So when you open such a big market as Mexico, it becomes really attractive. Mexico has good logistics, good telecom infrastructure. We have 120 million people, more than 40 million electricity consumers. So the market is big. Mexico is beautiful too. So I think it makes the whole package very, very attractive. And I worked before in international financing, and you can tell that these factors sometimes play a role. Mexico is really a big economy. And if you're looking at the screen, just look at the window, how big is Mexico City. I mean, Mexico City is around 20 million people. Excellent. So now let's move to the final part, and we are seeing this happening more quickly than that we thought, which is the retail side of the renewable energy development. As I said, in Mexico, we have 40 million electricity consumers, out of which 30% can be free consumers. So those consumers are free right now in the market to select their supplier. A movement is starting where big companies are purchasing by themselves renewables. A big beer company in Mexico just contracted directly, because they can do it through the private market, 100 megawatts of solar power. So the retail market is really developing quickly. We have around 417 generation permits right now, people wanting to invest in Mexico. We have 29 suppliers, these companies that would supply the unregulated market. We have 13 trading companies, and we have already 81 large industrial consumers that are selecting an alternative supplier. So the retail market is starting to develop, and this market, small, medium enterprises and residential consumers are finding now very attractive distributed generation. And I will explain, this is the last part of my presentation, what is happening with distributed generation in Mexico. We issue new regulations on distributed generation, which include 3 different formats for your how you engage with the grid and how your energy is remunerated. We have net metering, net billing, and if you have a plot of land, if you can install a solar power generator there, you just hook up into the grid and sell your energy to the spot market prices, which in some regions of Mexico are very attractive for small scale distributed generation. This is what is happening. Distributed generation is growing exponentially, and is growing in the areas of the country where we have lots of sun, which is most of it, and who is installing solar power in Mexico, rooftop solar power, small scale installations, is not only residential consumers. This is very important. So half of the installations are in residential consumers and half in small and medium-sized enterprises. You know, businesses, shopping centers, car manufacturers, small companies. So the growth in distributed generation is exponential these days in Mexico. So even though the regulated consumers cannot access the market under the electricity energy reform, a distributed generation figure appeared. This distributed generation figure is called exempted generation. And basically that says you can install up to 500 kilowatts of any power generation source without any permit. And you just have to follow interconnection rules, etc. But up to 500 kilowatts, which is not small really, 500 kilowatts is considerable. You can install it and you can supply energy in one of these 3 schemes that I just mentioned: net billing, net metering, or complete sale of your excess electricity or your total electricity to the distribution grid. So this is what I think is happening in Mexico, that the reform, even though we did it late, is moving really fast in a time where, you know, technology development combined with markets, clear and transparent rules are making us move pretty quickly in the clean energy transformation. I used to mention my personal anecdote. When I was a kid, we had to use wood. Imagine that, wood to heat our water at home when I was a kid. So I wanted to have a shower. Well, you put the wood in the boiler. I remember that. I did that until I was like 15 years old. Then the oil industry developed in Mexico. There was a refinery in Salamanca. From that refinery, we were able to get LPG gas. And this is interesting. Natural gas never arrived to this part of Mexico where I was born. but we had the sun. So most of my relatives in that part of Mexico, they leapfrog and avoided natural gas, and they jumped directly to solar water heating. Why? Because solar radiation in Mexico advanced of technologies, and we are seeing how now, with the reform, with the ability of the consumer to select their supplier, with the technology development and very clear, simple, transparent rules to access the grid, the renewable energy development is quickly moving. What I think could happen is that we could reach very large shares of viable renewables in a fraction of the number of the years that Spain or Germany needed. So that is a challenge. We need to quickly adapt the systems to make sure we can manage these renewable resources. So basically, that was the part of the presentation. I hope you have enjoyed it, and let's open now for questions and answers.
Thank you, Marcelino. Sorry, my something happened quickly. Thank you very much. I was particularly moved by your personal anecdote there at the end. And since you're obviously still very young, that wasn't that long ago that that was occurring in Mexico. So I appreciate the comprehensive presentation. But the personal anecdote is quite remarkable, and definitely makes you understand how quickly things have changed, particularly in some parts of Mexico, including where you grew up. Just a quick reminder for folks who, I think a lot of you have already figured it out and seen how to pose questions, but the way to pose questions, if you have any more, use the chat function right there. We have a lot of them here, but Marcelino, I was thinking about something as you spoke, and one of the things I tried to say at the beginning, and there's a lot to applaud, and again, congratulations to you and everyone across the entire government of Mexico, as well as the industry, for really moving so quickly on these reform measures. But one of the key things is sort of the what's next question. And let me put it into a very specific question for you that I think could be helpful to understand. You did a nice job of and you spoke very eloquently about the level of competition that the two auctions have created. The slides that listed the number of bidders, not to mention the logos of the bidders and those who actually won, I guess is better put. So the question I would have is, in terms of what's next, how confident is everyone that all of those projects will come online in the timeline and under the prescriptions of the bidding that was as the bidders won, in terms of the cost, but also the timeline and for the delivery of the energy and the certificates? I guess, to be very succinct, how are those projects developing, and are they all going to come online to the degree that they were committed?
Yes, that's a very good question, and this is also part of the change in the reform. So now it's the private sector who takes all those risks, construction, financing. We had very good news a couple of weeks ago. Many projects are arriving, financial closing, and they are building. So to the extent that they will finish on time, for the most part, it's a private sector question. We hope they move quick and they move as planned. They have to enter in particular dates. There are guarantees that will be triggered if they don't show up. But this is basically, the risk anyone is facing in any part of the world. You need to do your environmental, social clearing. So to give you a number of how many of those will enter, it would be too ambitious on my part, because I don't know what is the status of the project. But as you said, we have very robust private sector in Mexico. We have companies that have been here for a long time. We have top of the line companies. This is not to say that projects will not have a challenge, because every project has a challenge, as we know. But hopefully, as we learn through, all those projects will come online. The next auction is coming up, so you can always run another auction to compensate for projects that do not arrive on time. But basically, we are in the hands of the private sector here to push quickly for the projects. There is a public sector part, because the environmental and social clearance is is partially, of course, managed by the government, the Ministry of Energy and the Environmental Ministry, but hopefully things move as they move with infrastructure in Mexico. So if they move the way other projects have moved, I think we'll be successful.
Excellent. No, I think, and I was a bit inartful in my. There had been some commentary over the last several months, obviously, whether the record level prices and the commitments that some of these projects were making were going to be able to come online. But like you said, there's an auction process that maybe also looks at compensating for some of the potential fall off in some of those. Let me move to some of the questions our participants have posed. We'll just go in order as we receive them. There's a lot of different questions, but let me start with something I think that's pretty interesting about energy storage. And I know you just were here in San Diego participating in a huge event focused on storage. So speak a little bit, if you could, as to where energy storage fits in. And the specific question is energy storage considered under the energy transition law, particularly utility scale battery energy storage?
Yes, what has been surprising to us here at the Commission is that when we hear from consumers, large industrial consumers, when we hear from generation companies, they are telling us, it may make sense to me already to put storage to supply this factory and couple that with a generation facility. Some consumers also tell us, it makes sense for me. There is actually a study financed by the USTDA where they detect that in Mexico storage could be already large scale economically viable. So how is it considered for distributed regulations allow for behind the meter storage? You could install your storage already behind the meter for installations below 500 kilowatts. For large scale, what we are doing at the Commission and giving the interest from many consumers is to review our regulations and perhaps release something soon that basically recognizes all the services that storage provides. We will issue ancillary services regulation for frequency, voltage support, and black star capability, and we want to make that regulation storage ready. In the sense that if storage provides that service, it should be recognized. So this is something we are thinking on. We don't have a calendar, but we're already thinking on making sure that if anyone wants to put storage, they are recognized for the value that they provide. And this study by the USTDA actually identifies that in the next 5 years, there are 2,000 megawatts of storage that are economically viable in some pockets of the grid, because of the economics of transmission and arbitrage in the energy market. So it seems that the storage market in Mexico is attractive. We hope to issue some regulations in that regard and see how the market develops. But behind the meter right now, you can do it. We don't have statistics yet, but we are pretty sure some industries already had some small batteries coupled with their PV installations.
Oh, that's super. And I do want to talk a little bit more about distributed generation. Some of those things you pointed out, you called it the silent success. But I'm particularly, as a former USTDA employee, I'm particularly delighted to hear that such an important study has been completed. And if you could share that, maybe we could also make that available to everyone who's participating today. I think that could be very interesting to look at. So we'll look forward to that from you. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah. So here's an interesting question. I think, and I remember when we've had webinars and discussions in the past, a lot of confusion has stemmed from what is actually happening and how is it happening on the clean energy certificate market, so the cells as they are known. And the question here is, what is the price of cells? So maybe explain a little bit more, and I know you talked about it in the auction process, but answering that question, maybe also set the context for why Mexico chose the clean energy certificates as the way of helping to meet the clean energy goals set out in the coming years.
Yes, and that's an excellent question. If you see, the certificate system is a way, I would put it like this, to trade excess certificates, more like an opportunity market. The regulated market is contracted through auctions, and in those auctions, the generators are selling the energy, the certificates, and the capacity of the power plants. And they bid as a bundle all those three products. So they are selling their energy, their clean energy, and the capacity. So the implicit price of the certificate is in their offers. If you do a back of the envelope calculation, and don't take this number as a given because it's not an official number, I think it should be maybe $10 to $15. The implicit value of the certificate. This is not a market value yet. We will see a market value once people start exchanging certificates in the market in 2018. So the long-term auctions bring the investment, and those generators are already selling the certificates through their market. So if you compare the price of renewables with conventionals, you will see that the difference is not that much. That's what I say. In some cases, you could say it's $10 or is more or less. But with the declining prices of clean energy, of course, the certificate price will go down. That's obvious. So there is now an implicit value that you can quickly calculate from the auctions. The actual market value will start revealing next year. As I said, some companies are already buying their own renewable energy on the free market. Maybe they perceive that, if I can get $40 energy and it's clean already, that will help me meet the clean energy requirement. So that's where we are now. So an actual market price will start to be revealed in 2018. Implicit prices you can guess right now. You have $40 wind, $32 solar. That means the certificate implicit value is not that big.
So the clean energy certificates were an important policy tool as well. I mean, what we would call here, more, not exactly, but similar to a renewable portfolio standard, in that the clean energy certificates help you and help the authorities in Mexico to help, set that or make that gap up to meet the 25% goal for next year, right? I mean, so part of the clean energy certificate market is driven by the goal of the clean energy target in the coming years, right? So
yes, exactly. So, but you see, if you put the certificate system, you still need instruments that bring long-term investment. So that's why the long-term auctions are the mechanisms that for the regulated market will make sure those investments come, that those are lower price, that they are clean. So is in fact our system is, I would say, is a clean energy certificate system with these very important instruments to make sure the projects are bankable, are financeable, which is the long-term auction. So the certificate market will be the way to track that the clean energy target is met, and that if an industry is in excess or short of a few megawatts of clean energy, you can buy those through the certificate. But a certificate system by itself, without central contracting for the regulated market, maybe it would have a completely different result. So I think that the two mechanisms are working together towards meeting the goal.
Excellent. No, thanks for the clarification. A lot of other questions. Let me jump to one here that gets to the. We're talking a lot about the auction here and the bidding and the different parts of the bidding. Did bid evaluations consider base load generation versus intermittent generation?
Yes, this is a very important question. So basically, if you are a clean energy technology, you can sell energy, your certificate, and the capacity. So in terms of the capacity, the firm energy, they are all evaluated the same. However, in Mexico, capacity is the ability that you have to deliver power during the peak years of the year, the peak hours of the year. So here, basically, if a solar farm believes, let's assume it's a 100 megawatt facility, if he believes he can deliver 10 megawatts during the peak hour, he can make that bet and bid into the market only 10 megawatts. If you are a base load generation like geothermal power, which actually won also in the auction, I just mentioned solar and wind because they were the majority winners, but we had also geothermal power. and of course that geothermal facility offer most of its capacity to the market. So they are all compared equally under the basis of the belief that every resort has regarding meeting that peak power capacity. So they are compared exactly the same as if they were one or the other. For the most part, the auction is technology neutral for the most part.
Perfect. And there's some other questions here that get to some of the wow, thanks everyone for all the questions. This is fantastic. I think we've got unfortunately more material than we have time with the commissioner, but let's look at something here that continues on the discussion of sort of the project development and the question I posed at the beginning of the Q&A. There's a very specific question, Marcelino. Does the CRE have a time limit to respond to generation permits requested by power generators?
We CRE or the SENACE?
The question specifies CRE.
Yes, no, of course. We have by law, we have a timeline at which we have to respond when somebody is requesting a permit. Our statistics show that we are responding on time. Getting a generation permit is pretty straightforward. If you meet the requirements in the law, you get your permit. Why? Because now it's a free market activity. You're getting your license, and you get your license, and then you buy a car. So there is I don't remember the number of days because we always answer on time. We have issue, as I said, more than 100. Yes, the number of days we have to respond to any permit request is 90 days. And what I know from the governing body, being part of the governing body, is that our statistics in responding are very good. I always encourage any participant in the market that if they don't get a response on time, they go through our webpage and request for a meeting and ask what is happening with the permit. But the fact that this market is working is because we are implementing all regulations in a very effective and transparent way. We want the market to tell us if we are not doing well in one side. So please always send us the feedback.
Excellent. There's a couple more things I want to get to. I want to talk a little bit about grid reliability, and I certainly want to talk about the next auction. But first, there's a couple different questions. Let me lump them together about tariff regime. Can you talk a little bit about, I mean, what some of these questions ask is the evolution of the tariff regime and how that's progressing and when CRE will begin to publish the new tariff regime. So anything, I know that's sort of a broad compilation of questions and ideas there, but talk a little about the tariff regime, the evolution, and what's coming next.
Yes, excellent. And that's a very important question because I believe it's key for the development of the retail market. As I said, this retail market is developing. Large industries are selecting alternative suppliers. They are purchasing directly their clean energy, but many industries are not making that decision because one of the pieces of the reform implementation that we are working on is the evolution of the tariff regime. What do I mean by that? The reform clearly specifies that the old generation that belong to CFE, the most efficient power plants, are going to be contracted to supply the regulated service. When that happens, we have the cost of generation, then we add transmission, distribution, and retail to determine the market-ready rates for the regulated consumers. We're working on that process. I saw on the media yesterday that the Ministry of Energy issued the notification that the contracts are signed. So with that, hopefully in the next months, we will have the new tariff regime for the regulated service. This is a very important decision where not only us are involved. Why? Because the Ministry of Energy will sign the contracts. We issue the cost-efficient tariffs, and the Ministry of Finance at the same time has to issue the subsidies they believe they have to put in certain consumer classes. So this is really an interinstitutional work that we hope to implement through this year. Definitely. Some milestones have to be met before we could jump into that. One was the signature of the contracts. Those will be ready soon, I believe, in this or next week. So with that, we can start quickly moving towards issuing the new rates, and the Ministry of Finance to decide where do they want to put or to focalize the subsidy that they got approved in the budget for this year, because now the amount of the subsidies is approved in the Congress, which is, I believe, a very important feature of the reform. So we hope to have that issue through the remainder of this year. That's the plan.
Excellent. No, that's so imminent and coming soon. So thank you for clarifying the status and what's coming very soon and next. Before we talk about the next auction, let's talk about something that's very important, and it's something, you know, over the years when we talk about the further incorporation and deployment of renewable energy, and as clean energy targets and renewable portfolio standards get increased in various locales, the question of grid stability and reliability comes up, and there's a specific question here as to what policy measures and or strategies are being adopted to ensure grid stability and reliability, particularly related to projects closer to load center. Is there a good mix of renewable and conventional? So it's the increasing debate, and we saw it actually very interestingly with the solar eclipse here the other day in California, where the grid had a real challenge to manage through that because of the about 10,000 megawatts of solar that's on the system here. Talk a little bit about grid reliability.
Yes, excellent. And that's a very important question because, of course, we need to understand what are the impacts, what are the measures you can take to mitigate the potential impact. So before that, in the interconnected system in Mexico, we have hydro, gas, which is good to manage, you know, variability or intermittency. In the integrated system, the volume of variable renewables is not yet that big to be worried right now. However, we are already preparing with the reform to make sure we put the elements in place so that the system is managed properly as variables increase. Exactly what are we doing? As I said, the grid code, so the interconnection requirements for wind and solar plants are very modern. We don't want to have very old technologies that were not able to cooperate with the grid. And we have a big debate with the industry. They were very cooperative at commenting our regulations on grid interconnection requirements. But we have grid interconnection requirements that are very modern in the sense that wind and solar technologies, they need to cooperate to the extent possible with the reliability of the grid, especially frequency voltage control. That is one. The system operators, SENACE, in the market rules, it is already required that these facilities provide a forecast. And, you know, forecast is key, is the low-cost measures you can do to improve the short-term dispatch. So forecast is already provided by these facilities. SENACE takes this forecast and they improve it in a way that they know exactly what is going to happen with the resources. So as of today, I think the things we're putting in place are working. Looking ahead, and as you can see in the transmission expansion plans, some areas of the system could get a lot more of solar power, and we could start seeing maybe mini duck curves in Mexico, similar to California. But the system operator is doing a very good job at preparing with that. Especially, we have seen that if we interconnect the regions with more transmission, the variability problems will mitigate considerably. So we are aware of that. The system operator is constantly learning of experiences from other. I think right now, as we speak, there is a big conference on variability in the power grid. So the status is the level is not yet at that is creating problems, although our system and our regulations are preparing for modern technologies, and we are constantly in our transmission plans and our smart grid plan actually released yesterday, making sure we put the technologies to make this possible, because it's possible. We know it's possible, technically it's possible. Eclipses can be predicted with tremendous certainty. If something is easy to predict, it's an eclipse. I think we should be worried more about the traditional, you know, a line breaks out, conventional power generation breaks down. To predict that is almost impossible. to predict an eclipse. I think, the Mayans knew that 200 years ago how to predict it. So there are other things we need to look for, but we are constantly working on that. We even have collaboration agreements with NERC in the US. We constantly meet with our colleagues in California and PAM to learn as quickly as possible on the different solutions we need to implement. And just to make it short, because I think our challenge is that we could get to very large shares in a very short period of time. And that's the challenge, I would say, how to implement the solutions much quicker in a fraction of the time that California or Spain or Germany did. So that's why we're working very closely with SENACE and with colleagues from other system operators and regulators.
No, absolutely. And we could spend a lot more time on that, but I want to get to the final question. Thank you for that. No, absolutely. Eclipses of the nature we had this week are indeed quite predictable. So thanks for but absolutely the role of technology and how technology, battery energy storage or other elements of digital technology and how you manage some of these questions of intermittency are certainly on the tips of everyone's tongue and mind these days. Let's finish with the upcoming auction. I do want you to spend at least a minute or two before we wrap up talking about the upcoming auction. There was a specific question here regarding the auction, and somebody wants to understand how the size or the terms of the auction were determined. Specifically, they're curious why it's a smaller quote unquote auction than the last one. And then beyond this auction, so talk a little bit about that, and then talk about beyond the third auction, what you have in mind and what's on tap.
Exactly. So the size, there is there is an instrument that we issue at the Regulatory Commission, which is the coverage requirements. These long-term coverage requirements specify the amount of capacity and energy that the demand has to be contracted beforehand to meet the security requirements or the reserve requirements issued by the Ministry of Energy. So the size of the auctions is such that according to the predictions, the load will meet the contracting requirements. So basically what we want to make sure is that the load is contracted close to 100% 2-3 years in advance. The actual numbers are in this regulation that we issue, but basically gradually we want to make sure that 2 years in advance the load is perfectly contracted up to its maximum demand, plus the reserve margin that is in the supply security policy of SENER. So with those numbers, SENACE makes a calculation on what is the gap according to the predictions we have and how big needs to be the auction. So that's the way the requirement is set. So the third auction, the amount of energy that is going to be contracted is 6 terawatt hours. So it's not really smaller than the previous one. And what is important is that in this auction, not only the regulated service will be contracted, which is CFE. So now free consumers are also purchasing energy and clean energy in this auction. And in fact, of the total demand in the auction, roughly 10% comes from enterprises, consumers that are free consumers that wanted to join the auction to get these attractive prices. This is what happened when they saw the prices that are going to the regulated service, which is good. The free consumer said, I also want those prices. How can I access those? So a window was open so that they could access the auction. And out of the total demand in the auction, as I mentioned, 10% is coming from unregulated consumers, which is, businesses or suppliers of electricity. And the auction is running right now. Offers are being submitted, and the auction the results will be released according to calendar, by November 22nd of this year.
Excellent.
I hope that answered the question. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so in terms of future, it is you continue looking at what the system and trying to understand the needs of the system as well as the clean energy targets and such. So November 22nd.
Exactly.
look forward to some more record-setting announcements in terms of renewable energy from Mexico. Dr. Marcelino Madrigal, thank you so much for all of your time and efforts this morning to not only present the updates on what's going on in Mexico, but talk about some of the future and what's next, and provide so much information during this question and answer session. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks for sticking with us a few minutes past the top of the hour. I'd be remiss if I didn't also call attention to a couple other programs the Institute of the Americas is working on. At the end of September, together with the Secretary of Energy in Panama, we're convening a roundtable to talk about the role of LNG and natural gas, not just in the energy sector in Panama, but more broadly in the economy, and as that country continues its economic development, the role of the canal in terms of LNG and natural gas, perhaps as a shipborne propulsion fuel. Also, it's never too early to save the date for the La Jolla Conference next year. It's May 23rd and 24th here in La Jolla, of course. So that's all we've got. I want to say thank you to Intercap Energy Systems, our webinar series sponsor. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Jacqueline Sanchez, thank you, and we'll be in touch via email with further with the recording as well as the presentation from Dr. Madrigal. And don't forget to follow us on social media as my final parting words. And thank you again, Dr. Madrigal. Thanks to Craig. Congratulations. Best wishes, and we'll all be following the continued efforts from your colleagues across the Mexican government.
Yeah, thanks to all, Jeremy, and if you allow me also, if please any market participants, they are feeling that any regulation, that anything is not working properly, please get close to the Commission. There is a process by we can hear any issue you may have in accessing the grid. Please come to the Commission, explain to us what is happening. It really works. So we are a very open institution. Come to us and let us know what are your issues in accessing the markets, because this is all about that, making sure consumers can access the market. Thank you very much. Thanks to all.
Thank you. We will be sure to pass any comments along to you and your staff, Dr. Madrigal. Thanks again.
Bye.
Have a great day.